Hello, welcome to Human Rights Lesson 8. This is our last lesson for the term, and it's about the human genome and human rights related to recent technology in the field of genetic research. So what is the human genome? The human genome determines the characteristics of human beings. Basically, it's our DNA. Recent advances in technology have allowed researchers to edit and clone the human genome. And there are many ethical and moral questions raised about genetic research because of these new technologies. In 1996, Scottish researchers produced Dolly, who was a cloned sheep with the identical characteristics of another sheep. And in 1997, researchers in the US announced that they were going to try and duplicate the research about Dolly in human beings, which caused a great deal of distress amongst people in the scientific community. And there were many discussions about the ethics of cloning. If you watch the video here, as listed, you can see some of the arguments that were presented at the time. Now, after Dolly was cloned, there was further genetic research. There has been genetic research for many, many years. We've been able to sequence the human genome for a long time. So people can take a sample of your DNA and then they can figure out the base sequence of your DNA, basically. But more recently, they have developed a technology called CRISPR, which is a method of gene editing, which means that now researchers can take a bit of DNA they don't like, they can cut it out and replace it with some DNA that they do like. So, for example, what they can do now is they can replace the genetic sequence for eye color. So if you have a genetic sequence for brown eyes, they can replace that with a genetic sequence for blue eyes. So of course this raises some questions about designer babies. So in 2018, a research team in China announced that the world's first gene-edited babies had been born. The father of the girls was HIV positive, and before they were born, the girls' embryos were edited, the genetics were edited in the embryos so that the genes for HIV were disabled. Therefore, when the girls were born, they were in theory immune from HIV infection. You can watch the video here which tells you a bit more about the situation. Now, there are many ethical questions about gene editing and about cloning, right? So in terms of these children that were born, the argument was that the part of the DNA sequence that they edited also disabled some genes that might fight cancer. So there may be unexpected consequences from gene editing. Then we come to the wider issues of, well, if we can design how people look, people who don't look the right way may be discriminated against. So for example, people in Ireland might want everybody to have red hair and blue eyes. So if their parents are rich enough, they can edit the gene sequences to make sure their children have red hair and blue eyes. But people who haven't got the money to do that won't be able to do it. And the children without red hair and blue eyes would be discriminated against. There's also the idea that when you edit the genes in one generation, their children and their children's children will also have those edited genes. So you're basically making a decision not only for those people, but for generations to come. And then you come to the situation where who decides what genes are good or bad? Okay, so if you have someone like Hitler who didn't like people of different nationalities, you can have people editing genes for particular cultural characteristics, for particular physical characteristics like skin colour, eye colour, hair colour. And then there's the fact that who has access to this technology? Will it only be rich people, or will everybody have access to this technology? So there are a lot of ethical questions about gene editing. There are also many positives about gene editing. Basically, if you can edit for the elimination of inherited diseases, you may be able to wipe out cancer. Research into vaccines for COVID-19 will use this sort of technology. You can also eliminate birth defects, such as deafness or blindness in children. You can have cures for other inherited conditions like diabetes. You may also be able to enhance human brain power, and who knows where that will lead us. And you could also cure many psychological diseases which are related to genetic inheritance, such as manic depression, for example. So there are lots of positives about gene editing also. So there are lots of implications of genetic technology. And we can relate it to the UDHR, in particular Article 1, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. This is about the diversity of human beings. Gene editing can eliminate the diversity of human beings, and it could, in theory, mean that some people are favoured because their parents are wealthy enough to get their genes edited. So fundamentally, gene editing relates to all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, and to many, many, many articles of the UDHR. Okay, so in 1997, in response to the cloning of Dolly, the United Nations, UNESCO in particular, published the Universal Declaration on the Human Genome and Human Rights. And this made a direct connection between human genetic experimentation and human rights. And this declaration has many parts. It has a part about human dignity. It says everyone has a right to respect for their rights, regardless of their genetic characteristics. It has a part talking about the rights of the people concerned. What it means by this, that if people are being genetically experimented on, or if people donate their genetic material, they have to consent to that, and they have to have information about the consequences of the experimentation or changes to their genetic material. The declaration also talks about research into genetic material. It talks about it bans human cloning outright. It puts conditions on scientific activity and says that when you are doing experiments with the human genome, there should be ethics committees overseeing the ethics of your experiments. It also talks about solidarity and cooperation internationally. So there's this idea that scientific advancement in genetic experimentation and genetic modification should be shared internationally, and it should be regarded as an international issue rather than an issue of just one country in particular. Now, I'm not sure how many people actually adhere to the Universal Declaration on the Human Genome and Human Rights. And it's very, very easy to buy pieces of DNA on the internet if you want to experiment on them. For example, just a quick Google search I did came up with integrated DNA technologies on this website, and they sell G-Blox gene fragments, double-stranded linear nucleic acids with the perfect combination of excellent sequence fidelity, affordability, and application flexibility. So you can buy slices of DNA on the internet. And also there are these very interesting people, the biohackers of Sydney. And the biohackers of Sydney are people who experiment with genetics, with genes. And they're just down the road in Sydney, and they're just a bunch of science students from Sydney University, most of them, and they experiment with genetic manipulation in a garage somewhere, probably a lab, I'd say. So you can see it's not something that's confined to research laboratories. It's something that some people who have the knowledge can do at home. So in theory, you could develop diseases by buying slices of DNA. Now, of course, where do people like integrated DNA technologies get their DNA fragments from? Is a good question. Well, if you have seen those Ancestry.com advertisements to find out your family tree through genetic testing, you'll find that in that agreement, you give Ancestry the ownership of that slice of DNA you send them, and they in turn apparently sell it off to various scientific labs around the world. So when you spit into a cup or you get a swab of your cheek cells and send it off to Ancestry, your DNA could be heading off to some of these laboratories, such as integrated DNA technologies. And you really don't have much of a say over it because you sign over your rights when you do that. So look, there are a lot of questions about genetic research. Genetic technology could solve the problem of COVID-19. Through genetic manipulation, we could find a vaccine for the virus. And of course, genetic modification and the ability to sequence DNA has really improve the health outcomes of lots of people with diseases nowadays. So science is good. However, the point is you have to think about the ethical and human rights issues related to scientific experimentation. So sometimes science unregulated can be chaotic, perhaps, is what we could say. Anyway, it's a question that's going to come up more and more in the next decades or so. So it's certainly worth thinking about the ethical and human rights implications of scientific research in general, and in particular when it comes to the modification of the human genome.